විම් දියර මිලිලීටර් 100 ස්මාර්ට් පැක් එක රුපියල් 85ට දැන් වෙළඳ පොලේ.
හරිම සුමුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this is Tuesday the 28th of February 2023. Resilient recovery. International community must step in and help Sri Lanka strike a balance between critical reforms and ensuring sustainable economic opportunities to access safety nets. New avenues. Inviting private investors for nuclear energy and alternative energy source and electric buses for public transport gets cabinet go-ahead. External sector. Sri Lanka's January trade deficit narrows and workers' remittances improve. Slowed pace. Sri Lanka's inflation eases to just above 50% in February, reflecting reduction in food prices, but non-food inflation climbs to 58.8%. Stopgap. President gazettes health, fuel supply and other services as essential services ahead of trade union protests scheduled for tomorrow.
Alliance Finance මෙතුරු රන්නයි සේවාවෙන් රන් පවුමකට රුපියල් 1,70,000ක ඉහළ අධිකාරම.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9 with Andrew Bernard. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
A very good evening and welcome to AdaDerana 24's English News. In your top story for tonight, Sri Lanka will explore the option of power generation using nuclear energy and enter into relevant agreements in the future. The cabinet approval was granted to the proposal to appoint a steering committee and 9 action committees to look into nuclear energy as an alternative to meet Sri Lanka's future energy needs. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka will also invite investors to enter into public-private partnerships for public transport service with battery-powered buses. A pilot project in this regard will be implemented in the Colombo and Gampaha districts. The Cabinet of Ministers granted approval to the proposal to implement a public-private partnership project for the operation of battery-powered electric buses by the Sri Lanka Transport Board based on a feasibility study. The proposal in this regard was put forth in order to reduce the cost of implementing fossil fuels to face the international energy crisis. The project will be carried out covering the western province centered on the commercial city of Colombo and the Gampaha district. The approval was also granted to prepare a draft bill with provisions necessary to establish a national contributory pension fund to ensure an appropriate environment to spend their retired life and to provide a pension with a certain profit for the retired life of the state sector pensioners. Accordingly, 8% of the basic salary of the employees and 12% of the employer should be credited to the proposed fund when a state employee is recruited in the state service. As such, an independent entity governed by the Board of Management to manage the proposed contributory pension fund will be established and a fund manager with special skills will be appointed for the management of the funds. The proposed National Contributory Pension Scheme will be applicable to the individuals newly recruited to the government service, whereas those recruited in the government service after the month of January 2016 can contribute to the proposed National Contributory Pension Scheme as per their consent. In the meantime, the Cabinet also gave the green light to gazette the Prevention of Terrorism Temporary Provisions Act No. 48 of 1979 and forward it to the Parliament. In addition, the Cabinet gave the go-ahead to gazette the draft bill that was prepared to assist and protect the victims and witnesses of a crime. The clearance of the Attorney General has been granted for the bill drafted by the legal draftsman. Meanwhile, the Cabinet also gave the go-ahead to the proposal presented by the President to expedite the negotiations regarding the proposed preferential trade agreement with Bangladesh under the guidance of the International Trade Office. This was presented after identifying that the preferential trade agreement with Bangladesh can boost bilateral trade over existing trade agreements. In the meantime, the green light was also given to consider nuclear energy as an alternative to meet Sri Lanka's future energy needs. In accordance with that decision, a steering committee and 9 action committees have been appointed to study matters related to electricity generation using nuclear energy.
ලංකා ඉතිහාසයේ මේ දක්වා කිසිම දිනක න්‍යෂ්ටික බලශක්තිය උපයෝගී කරගෙන විදුලිය නිපදවලා නැහැ. ජාත්‍යන්තර සම්මුතියෙන් අනුව ගිවිසුම් වලට එළඹෙන්න තිබෙනවා. එවැනි ගිවිසුම් වලට එළඹීම සඳහා අනුමැතිය ලබා දුන්නා.
Now, the World Bank Vice President for South Asia, Martin Reiser, reaffirmed the World Bank's continued support to help the country navigate economic challenges, implement critical reforms and chart a path towards a resilient and inclusive recovery. Reiser met with Sri Lanka's President and Minister of Finance, Ranil Wickremesinghe, Secretary of the Treasury, Governor of the Central Bank, senior government officials, development partners and key opinion leaders, including members of Sri Lanka's opposition, think tanks, civil society organizations and academia. World Bank Vice President for South Asia, Martin Reiser, concluded his 4-day visit to Sri Lanka today. During the visit, Reiser discussed progress on reforms to transform economic governance in Sri Lanka through strengthened institutional and fiscal oversight and better debt management. He also stressed the greater transparency, improved governance, support for job creation, as well as better targeted protection for the poorest are critical to garner and sustain public support for reforms. Now, the Vice President of the South Asian region of the World Bank, Martin Reiser, meanwhile says that the international community must step in and help Sri Lanka strike a balance between pursuing critical reforms to get the economy back on track and ensuring that the people have access to safety nets, better jobs and economic opportunities. Commenting on Sri Lanka's current economic situation, he added that in order for the people to not lose patience with the government's reforms, debt relief from creditors and fresh financing from international financial institutions remain urgent. He went on to say that the World Bank is helping Sri Lanka to make a transition towards a more private sector-driven and outward-looking economy.
Vice President of the South Asian region of the World Bank, Martin Reiser, says that debt relief from Sri Lanka's creditors and fresh financing from international financial institutions are urgent to ensure that the people don't lose patience with reforms and that opportunity for a change isn't lost. In an article written by Reiser, he said that the depth of the crisis has made it clear that Sri Lanka needs a new development model, but that the road to recovery is challenging and the necessary fiscal adjustment measures can be painful. He added that the international community must help Sri Lanka strike the right balance between pursuing critical reforms to get the economy back on track and ensuring that people have access to safety nets, better jobs and economic opportunities. He went on to say that as Sri Lanka recovers, it is essential not only to help people escape poverty and vulnerability, but also to strengthen their resilience to future shocks in an increasingly volatile world. The Vice President of the World Bank said that linking cash transfer beneficiaries to economic opportunities and complementary measures such as skills trainings, job coaching and access to finance can make Sri Lankans more employable, enabling them to rebuild their assets and improve their economic well-being. He added that these interventions can be catalyzed by measures that promote job creation through an improved business environment and access to finance, especially to support small and medium firms that are prevalent across Sri Lanka. Reiser said that with every crisis comes an opportunity and that for Sri Lanka it is a pivotal moment and a chance to reset its development model towards green, resilient and inclusive growth.
Now, Foreign Minister Ali Sabri is scheduled to begin an official visit in India on Thursday, where he will attend a conference on geopolitics and also hold high-level bilateral talks on the sidelines of the event. Minister Sabri is to attend the 8th edition of the Raisina Dialogue, India's premier conference on geopolitics and geoeconomics, to be held in New Delhi from the 2nd of March to the 4th. The conference is hosted by the Observer Research Foundation in partnership with the Ministry of External Affairs of India. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Minister Ali Sabri is scheduled to participate in 2 panel discussions on Friday. The Sri Lankan Foreign Minister will also meet with his counterparts from several countries for bilateral discussions, focusing on new avenues to strengthen mutually beneficial cooperation. Now, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka points out that the deficit in the merchandise trade account narrowed in January 2023 compared to a year ago due to subdued import expenditure, even as export earnings decreased. This development comes as trade deficit widened in January 2023 compared to the deficit recorded in December of last year.
The Central Bank of Sri Lanka today released a statement on Sri Lanka's external sector performance in January 2023. According to the release, the deficit in the merchandise trade account narrowed to $410 million in January 2023 from $857 million recorded in January 2022 due to a larger decline in imports compared to the decline in exports. However, the merchandise trade deficit in January 2023 widened compared to the deficit of $358 million recorded in December 2022. Earnings from merchandise exports declined by 11.3% in January 2023 over January 2022 to $978 million, continuing the moderation observed since September 2022, though at a slower pace than expected. Meanwhile, at the opposite side of the trade account, expenditure on merchandise imports remained at subdued levels in January 2023. Accordingly, expenditure on imports declined by 29.2% year-on-year to $1.388 billion in January 2023 compared to $1.959 billion recorded in January 2022 and $1.426 billion in December 2022. The decline in expenditure in all sectors contributed to this decline, although the decline in intermediate goods contributed the most. On positive developments, workers' remittances recovered to $437 million during January 2023 in comparison to $259 million in the corresponding month in the previous year. Tourist arrivals also increased in January 2022 to 102,545 compared to 91,961 arrivals recorded in December 2022 and 82,327 recorded in January 2022. Meanwhile, total departures for foreign employment were recorded at 24,236 during the month of January 2023. Total departures for foreign employment comprised of 7,556 unskilled workers, 7,283 skilled workers, and 6,120 workers under the domestic aid category. Gross official reserves stood at $2.1 billion as at the end of January 2023. This included the swap facility from the People's Bank of China equivalent to around $1.4 billion, which is subject to conditionalities on usability. The central bank recorded a net absorption of foreign exchange from the market in January 2023, resulting in a marginal improvement in liquid reserves by the end of January 2023. Exchange rates continued to remain stable through January 2023 with a marginal appreciation. Accordingly, during the year up to the 28th of February 2023, the rupee recorded an appreciation of 0.4% against the US dollar. Meanwhile, reflecting cross-currency movements, the Sri Lankan rupee appreciated against the euro, the pound sterling, the Japanese yen, the Indian rupee and the Australian dollar during the year up to the 28th of February 2023.
Now, the Department of Census and Statistics reports that the Colombo Consumer Price Index for the month of February 2023 is 189.5, up by 0.47 compared to January 2023. However, the department went on to say that the year-on-year measurement of inflation by CCPI February recorded an inflation value of 50.6%, down from 51.7% in January 2023.
Releasing a statement on inflation as reported by the Colombo-based index, the Department of Census and Statistics highlighted that the Colombo Consumer Price Index has been rebased to 2021 from 2013 in order to accommodate to the changing expenditure patterns. Accordingly, the rebased Colombo Consumer Price Index for all items in the month of February 2023 was recorded at 189.5, up to 0.47% compared to January 2023. The month-on-month changes were mainly influenced by the decreases in food items by 0.74% and an increase in non-food items by 1.2%. On the year-on-year inflation, as reported by the CCPI, a 50.6% inflation was recorded in February 2023, down from a year-on-year inflation of 51.7% in January of 2023. Meanwhile, the year-on-year inflation of the food group decreased to 54.4% in February 2023 from 60% in January 2023, while the year-on-year inflation of the non-food group increased to 48.8% in February 2023 from 47.9% in January. The contribution of food commodities to inflation stood at 17.23%, while non-food commodities contributed 33.36%. The contribution of the non-food commodities was significantly higher due to the inflation in sectors such as transport and housing, water, electricity, gas and other fuels, which recorded increases of 11.59% and 6.71% respectively.
Now, hospitals specializing in cancer treatment are to be established in 4 districts in Sri Lanka. The President's Media Division statement said that specialized hospitals to treat cancer patients are to be set up in the districts of Jaffna, Hambantota, Badulla and Anuradhapura, along with a specialized modern children's hospital at a convenient location. The PMD communique noted that the Secretary to the Ministry of Health was instructed by the President's Secretary Samaneka Nayaka to take the necessary measures as per the directive of President Ranil Wickremesinghe. The Secretary to the Ministry of Health has been further instructed to appoint a committee to analyse the possibility of initiating a modern laboratory on medical research, and a report regarding the matter is to be submitted within 2 months. Now, several trade unions, including from essential services, are to engage in a joint strike tomorrow against the government's new tax policy. Ahead of the planned protest, President Ranil Wickremesinghe issued a gazette declaring all services related to health, ports, airports and passenger transport services as essential services.
Several trade union organizations of the country say they will engage in a massive strike tomorrow in protest over the government's new tax policy and several other issues at hand. It was announced that the trade unions from the essential service sector, including power, petroleum, water, ports, telecom and banks, will engage in a one-day strike action. The trade union of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka has also extended its support towards the strike action. Meanwhile, the Government Medical Officers Association today held a meeting following which they announced that the GMO will not be part of tomorrow's strike action but will engage in a demonstration. Further, trade unions of the postal and railway workers also announced that they will not join the strike but will only protest to support the action. The Salon Teachers Union meanwhile announced that they will not support the strike and declared that they would report to duty tomorrow clad with black bands.
Meanwhile, speaking at the Cabinet media briefing early today, Cabinet spokesperson Dr. Bandula Gunawardena said that a new Responsibility Act should be brought into law to manage the government finances regardless of the government's change. Referring to the taxation policy, the minister said that global standard for government revenue is 20% or more of the GDP of that country, although in Sri Lanka, the proportion is just 8% of GDP.
ජනතාවට බලපාන ජනතාවගේ වැටුප් ගෙවීම සඳහා තමයි බදු එකතු කරන්නේ. බදු නැතුව රටක් ආණ්ඩු කරන්න බෑ. දිගින් දිගටම මේ ආදායම කඩා වැටිලා තියෙන නිසා දලදේශීය නිෂ්පාදනයේ 120ක් හෝ ඊට වඩා වැඩි ප්‍රමාණයක් රජයේ ආදායම වෙන්න ඕනේ. ඒක තමයි ලෝක සම්මත නියමය. රටේ ජාතික නිෂ්පාදනයේ 100ක් නම් එකෙන් පහෙන් එකක්වත් ආණ්ඩුවට දෙන්න ඕනේ පොදු සේවා සැපීම සඳහා. අපේ තියෙන්නේ 108යි. ආණ්ඩු වෙනස් වුණත් වෙනස් කරන්න බැරි වෙන ආකාරයට මූල්‍ය කළමනාකරන වගකීම් 50ක් අලුතෙන් සම්මත කරන්න වෙයි පාර්ලිමේන්තුවට.
Meanwhile, during a meeting held under the patronage of Speaker of Parliament today, a proposal was made to summon the Secretary to the Ministry of Finance to the Parliament. The proposal was made considering the failure of the Ministry of Finance to provide adequate funds to hold the local government elections. Several SJB parliamentarians, including opposition leaders Sajith Premadasa, were present at the meeting, along with independent members, including Dallas Alaperuma. A proposal was also made at the meeting by opposition leader Sajith Premadasa to transfer the funds allocated for the elections under Budget 2023 for the purpose of holding the local government election. Speaker of Parliament Mahinda Yapa Vivardhana agreed to the proposal. Now, the leader of the Samagi Jana Balawegaya, Sajith Premadasa, guarantees that his party will dedicate itself to win the vote of the people democratically. Speaking in an election campaign rally in Kuliyapitiya, he further stated that the president's only target is to postpone the elections.
The Samagi Jana Balawegaya held an election campaign rally in Kuliyapitiya yesterday under the patronage of its party leader, Sajith Premadasa.
The president's target is to only postpone elections. By taking the presidential power into his hands, he decides that he is the secretary to the Ministry of Finance, chairman of the Election Commission, and head of the government press, apart from being the president itself, and that the country can be manipulated by him. I tell President Ranil Wickremesinghe that whether anyone likes it or not, he already has blood on his hands. We dedicate ourselves to democratically win the people's vote.
අපි අනිවාර්යෙන්ම කැප වෙනවයි කියන එක මම මේ අවස්ථාවේ කියන්න කැමතියි.
Welcome back. Now, the appointed 5-member ministerial committee to expedite investigations into the goods detained by the Sri Lanka Customs was done today. The decision was taken in response to the significant delays and inefficiencies in the inspection and investigation procedures of the Sri Lanka Customs in relation to goods detained by the Customs. Accordingly, the committee is expected to streamline the Customs procedure, particularly regarding the detained goods, and to ensure smooth and efficient functioning of Sri Lanka Customs. It is further expected to identify any amendments that need to be made to the Customs Ordinance and present them to the Cabinet of Ministers. The committee is headed by the Minister of Ports, Shipping and Aviation, Nimal Siripala de Silva. The other committee members are Minister of Plantation and Industries Dr. Ramesh Patirana, State Ministers of Finance Ranjit Siyamala Pittiya and Shehan Semsingha, the State Minister of Investment Promotion Dilu Mamunugama. Now, the Minister of Tourism Harin Fernando revealed today that Sri Lanka's tourism arrivals crossed 100,000 for the second consecutive month in February this year. As reported by the Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority, arrivals stood at 102,545 in January this year, with more tourists arriving from Russia, India, the UK, Germany and France.
Tourism has been one of Sri Lanka's largest foreign exchange earners. In 2018, receipts from tourism peaked at $5.61 billion on 2.3 million tourist arrivals. However, owing to the Easter Sunday terror attacks, COVID-19 and Sri Lanka's economic collapse, tourist arrivals depleted substantially in the subsequent years. According to figures compiled by the Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority, in 2019, arrivals dipped by 18% to 1.9 million tourists from 2.3 million tourists in the preceding year. In 2021, arrivals dropped 61.7% to just 194,495 arrivals from 507,704 arrivals in 2020. However, arrivals picked up 270.2% in 2022 to 719,978 arrivals from the preceding year's 194,495 arrivals. Following these developments, Minister of Tourism Harin Fernando stated today that Sri Lanka recorded 100,000 tourists within the first 26 days of February 2023, making this the second consecutive month in which Sri Lanka's tourism industry has seen such numbers. As per the statistics compiled by the Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority, a total of 102,545 tourist arrivals were recorded in January this year. Analyzing arrivals by nationality in January of this year, the Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority highlighted that Russian tourists visited the most, with 25,254 tourists arriving during the period. As a percentage of total arrivals, Russia's tourist arrivals stood at 24.6%. India came in second, claiming 13.4% of the total share of arrivals, with 13,759 arrivals in January alone. The United Kingdom and Germany followed next, claiming 8.2% and 8% of the total arrivals respectively. 8,483 British tourists arrived in January of this year, while 8,217 German tourists arrived during the same period. Meanwhile, French arrivals stood at 4,840 in January, claiming 4.7% of total arrivals. The Sri Lanka Tourism Development Board also identified Spain, China and Japan to be the top 3 potential markets in January of 2023. Arrivals of Spanish tourists stood at 857 or 0.8% of total arrivals, while Chinese arrivals were at 835 or 0.8% of total arrivals. Japanese arrivals stood at 744 in January of 2023, claiming 0.7% of total arrivals.
Now, at the Colombo Stock Exchange, the main all-share price index edged down due to price losses in counters such as Chevron Lubricants, Hatton National Bank and Valuable One, while the more liquid S&P also closed in red. Turnover crossed 1.4 billion rupees. Highest net worth and institutional investor participation was noted in Lanka IOC, John Keel's Holdings and Aitken Spence. Foreign participation in market activity remained at subdued levels, with foreigners closing as net buyers. During the month so far, the ASPI and the S&P SL20 gained 3.6% and 1.2% respectively, whilst recording a daily average turnover of 101.87 billion rupees. And that's all the news we have for this evening. Join us again tomorrow for the very latest news at the very same time. Subscribe to our social media pages to stay updated. Have a pleasant evening and good night.
For news and information you can trust 24 hours a day, visit AdaDerana.lk.